kind of briefly rehearse where we were because we're in a lot of historical material and we'll be there for quite some time in finishing up the books of Maccabees. We'll finish up 2nd Maccabees fairly quickly because it just goes really down to the end of Judas' life. Whenever we pick up Jonathan, which will be the next important brother, and then Simon, the next important brother, and then John Hyrcanus, another figure, that will take us for several weeks, and that will take us all the way through the end of 1st Maccabees then. We're looking campaign by campaign at the Maccabees, at their most important leader, Judas Maccabaeus, who's taken over in 166 BC after the death of his father, Mattathias, retired priest. Keep in mind we're talking about a priestly family here. That will become important whenever we get down to the rule of Jonathan, probably towards the end of the message next week and the week after that. We go according to schedule. And Judas has been very, very successful, and it's been important for him to be successful, Judas Maccabaeus, because we're in the early phases, in the early stages of the Jewish resistance movement. And it gives them quite a lot of courage for Judas and his followers to be as successful as we see that they are. We've gone through, we're taking it point by point, number by number. We're on number 6, by the way, this evening. That's a little artificial to try to study it like that, but it's a little easier, for you anyway, if I break it down instead of just rambling on and on and on historically and not somehow fitting it together for you to understand what I'm talking about. We've looked at 4 campaigns. The first one against Apollonius, then against Seron, and a couple against Lysias. That would take us through numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. We ended with number 5 and with 1 Maccabees chapter 5, which was not one specific campaign of Judas or any of his brothers or comrades against one of the Syrian leaders or generals, but we just described chapter 5 as various scattered battles between the people in the Jewish resistance movement and the Gentile nations around them. They go across the Jordan, southeast of the Dead Sea, and do some fighting, and up in Gilead they do some fighting, and over on the Mediterranean Sea coast they do some fighting. So we're just talking about various battles against various Gentile nations, not all with a Greek or Syrian background, of course, but if they are fighting, as we see in these first 2 verses here, if they're fighting against Israel, that is, these Gentile nations, it's because they're on the side of Syria as far as being opposed to Israel. Here we read, when the Gentiles round about heard that the altar had been rebuilt and the temple rededicated. Remember we discussed that. That was probably the most important thing we've looked at. The feast of Hanukkah, or the rededication of the altar in the temple. When the Gentiles round about heard that, they were furious and determined to wipe out all those of the race of Jacob who lived among them. Thus began the work of massacre and extermination among the people. So that's what all of chapter 5 is about. Now I said that this week we'd pick up with meanwhile. Meanwhile, what is going on? Well, meanwhile, we have to go back to Antiochus Epiphanes. If you remember back in the days of watching cartoons on Saturday morning, the really good ones always would end with a cliffhanger, and then you'd have to wait until next week to get back to it. And they'd introduce that next week's program by saying, meanwhile, all of this is going on. Well, you have to stay up with our meanwhiles. Meanwhile, Antiochus Epiphanes has been traveling in Persia. Remember who Antiochus Epiphanes is. Now, he's the most important figure of what we've been studying Daniel 11 the past year for so much. Revolves around that one figure, Antiochus Epiphanes. But we're going to part company, well, not us with him, but he from us tonight, because he's going to die. So we'll be through talking about Epiphanes after a few moments. Epiphanes has been traveling in Persia for a couple of reasons. We said, number 1, he's traveling to put down a revolt, not just Persia, but the eastern frontier. To put down a revolt on the eastern frontier of his empire by people such as the Bactrians and the Parthians, and you're probably familiar with those names, and other groups of tribes, nomadic or semi-nomadic people, or stationary people like remnants from the Medo-Persian Empire. He's gone to put down a revolt there. According to what we saw earlier back in chapter 3, he's left half of his army, half of his power with this Lysias, and of course gave the commandment to Lysias to go and destroy the Jewish resistance movement down in Judea. Of course he tries, of course he's not very successful, of course he's totally unsuccessful. And Epiphanes, well, he's not so successful himself. First of all, let's go back to 1 Maccabees 3 and verse 31, where we see this beginning, and then we'll have to pick up with it over here in chapter 6, which is where we'll begin tonight. But where we see Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, leaving for Persia. And here we're going to find, I believe, the second reason. I just gave you the first one, to put down a revolt, and here you'll find the second reason. For a time, Antiochus Epiphanes was much perplexed. 1 Maccabees 3:31. The reason why, you can see in the preceding 3 verses. Then he decided to go to Persia, collect the tribute due from the provinces, and raise a large sum of ready money. We understand from the previous verses that his treasury is just about empty at this time. He's bankrupt, in other words. And so he goes with 2 purposes in mind: to collect money while he's putting down revolt. And that'd be a good thing to do, too, at the same time. You put down the people, then you take their money away from them once you put them down. So we see this in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Meanwhile, we're saying Epiphanes was traveling in Persia. You have to skip from 3:31 over to 6:1 to pick up the thread of the story. As King Antiochus marched through the upper provinces, he heard, probably putting down a revolt there, he heard there was a city in Persia called Elymais, famous for its wealth in silver and gold. Its temple was very rich, full of gold shields, coats of mail, and arms, left there by Alexander, the son of Philip, king of Macedon, and the first to be king over the Greeks. So we see what he's doing. He's going to try to go into some of these temples. We've discussed this before, as a matter of fact, as well. He's going to go into some of these temples and try to rob them, and thus increase his own treasury at home. Is he successful? No, he's unsuccessful. 1 Maccabees 6, 3-4, and 2 Maccabees 9, 1 and 2. He is not successful. Antiochus came and tried to capture and plunder the city, but failed, because his plan had become known to the citizens. They gave battle and put him to flight, and he withdrew to Babylon in bitter disappointment. He's not successful. Then, according to the writer of 2 Maccabees, chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. It so happened that about this time Antiochus had returned in disorder from Persia. He had entered the city of Persepolis. Writer of 2 Maccabees and the writer of 1 Maccabees differ on what the city was, but anyway, he entered the city of Persepolis and attempted to plunder its temples and assume control. But the populace rose and rushed to arms in their defense, with the result that Antiochus was routed by civilians and forced to beat a humiliating retreat. So he's gone to Persia, and he's not been successful. Then, thirdly, concerning Epiphanes, first of all, we see his trip, then we see that it lacked success, and finally, he dies himself. 1 Maccabees 6, 5-17, 2 Maccabees 9, 3-29. We're trying to give you all the verses, or most of them, to put the books together in the right order. Now, the accounts differ considerably. I guess the bottom line is the same. He ends up dead. But the accounts are remarkably different. 1 Maccabees 6, verses 5-17. We'll read that to begin with. And 2 Maccabees 9, 3-29. He hears that while he's over in Persia, that Lysias, of course, has not been successful against Judas. And verse 8, When the king heard this news, he was thrown into such deep dismay that he took to his bed, ill with grief at the miscarriage of his plans. Miscarriage of his plans, ill with grief because of the fact that Lysias has been defeated now in 2 earlier campaigns against Judas. There he lay for many days, his bitter grief breaking out again and again, and he realized that he was dying. So he summoned all his friends and said to them, "Sleep has deserted me," so forth, "but now I remember the wrong I did in Jerusalem, when I took all her vessels of silver and gold, when I made an unjustified attempt to wipe out the inhabitants of Judea. It is for this," he says, "it is for this that I'm suffering all of this penalty and tribulation." He summoned Philip, one of his friends, and appointed him regent over his whole empire, giving him the crown, the royal robe, and the signet ring, with authority to make his son king after him. And so he dies in the year 164 BC. We're not told a lot about his death except that he does die, or that he did die, and this interesting account in verses 12 and 13, that in his mind's eye it's for retribution that he's dying because of what he did to Israel earlier. And that's interesting. We don't know that that's true. We don't know, for instance, the source for the material of the author of 1 Maccabees. Obviously, the author of 1 Maccabees wasn't there in his pavilion or tent whenever he was dying. So how in the world, or where in the world, and didn't get it from the Holy Spirit because these books aren't inspired. So how in the world and where in the world did he get such information? We don't know. A lot of what he tells us where he wasn't there or no Jew could have been there is reliable. That may well be reliable. We don't know. Then in 2 Maccabees 9, verses 3 to 29, we have an expanded account and maybe somewhat more embellished, or maybe just embellished compared to the 1 Maccabees account. Whenever he's over near Ecbatana, verse 3, then news reaches him of what happened to Nicanor and the forces of Timotheus. There were other leaders, remember, that had been appointed, like Ptolemaeus and others that had been appointed under Lysias. But riding, the middle of verse 4, but riding with him was the divine judgment. In his arrogance, he said, "When I reach Jerusalem, I'll make it a common graveyard." But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him a fatal and invisible blow. As soon as he had said the words, he was seized with incurable pain in his bowels and with sharp internal torments, a punishment entirely fitting one who had inflicted similar punishments on others. He fell out of his chariot as it hurtled along, and so violent was his fall that every joint in his body was dislocated. Verse 9, worms swarmed even from the eyes of this godless man. You can tell the author is telling the story with much relish. And while he was still alive and in agony, his flesh rotted off. The whole army was disgusted by the stench of his decay. And it was so unbearably offensive that nobody could escort the man who only a short time before had seemed to touch the stars in the sky. In this broken state, Antiochus began to abate his great arrogance. It is right to submit oneself to God, and being mortal, not to think oneself equal to him. And so we see, for instance, in verse 19 down through verse 27, he more or less writes a letter of apology to the Jews for all that he's done. Look at verse 19. "To my worthy citizens, the Jews," a little late for a confession though, "warm greetings and good wishes for their health and prosperity from Antiochus." Verse 28, the footnote to Epiphanes, we'll be through discussing him. "Thus this murderer and blasphemer, suffering the worst of agonies, such as he had not made others suffer, met a pitiable end in the mountains of a foreign land. His body was brought back by Philip, his intimate friend, but he was afraid of Antiochus' son and went over to Ptolemy Philometor in Egypt." Well, of course, we would still maybe want to speculate a little as to how much of a comparison we would scripturally be able to draw between Epiphanes and who he foreshadows, Antichrist. But one thing that is certain is, since we see from Revelation chapters 19 and 20 that Antichrist does have a very, very terrible end as far as his destruction is concerned, that perhaps some of this story is true, so that it would be a fitting type of what the end-time persecutor of the Jews himself was ultimately going to experience. I mean, it'd be one thing if he just kind of died a natural death, but with both books saying that he does not die a natural death, at least that much of the story must be a germ truth, that he died probably from some severe affliction that God had sent the man personally. But be that as it may, probably some type of terrible death to serve as a proper shadow and type for the way Antichrist would perish. So in 164 then, if you look on your chart, you may want to acclimate yourself to the period and the people related to this. His son, Antiochus, who becomes Antiochus V Eupator, comes to the throne. You'll see he'll only rule for a couple of years, just a very, very short period of time. And I don't think we'll have much to say about Eupator because he's not that important. Whenever we get down to Demetrius, the first Soter, the next king, who was the son of Seleucus IV, and Alexander Ballas, who was well, we don't know exactly who Ballas was. He said that he was another surviving son of Epiphanes. And he comes and tries to take the throne away from Demetrius, and he's successful. We'll discuss all of that later on. But who he really was, no one knows. He went by the name, or he said that his name was Alexander Epiphanes, but he's become known in history as Alexander Ballas. And then we see another couple of kings, Demetrius and another Antiochus, that will come on the scene. So Eupator's not that important, but if you trace him and his period upwardly on the chart, you see that it will connect with the time of Judas. So we're still talking about this short period of about 6 or 7 years where Judas is in control and he's the important figure. According to your chart, and this is probably fairly reliable, from 166 to 160, we see Judas Maccabaeus as being important. So that was our meanwhile of what's going on. That's a little interlude here in the books of Maccabees, but it's important because the Jews, of course, would want to know what happened to their most terrible persecutor of the past. So connecting this message with last week's, that would bring us to number 6 then. Number 6, as far as our campaigns are concerned, are important points. Epiphanes is just a sidelight, just an addition. Here on number 6, we're going to have the next campaign of Judas, which will bring us into the middle of 1 Maccabees 6, where he attacks the citadel in Jerusalem. And this starts a whole new major Syrian offensive. One that in the beginning does not go so well for the Jews in Israel. Now, have the Maccabees suffered any defeats up until this time? No, technically they have not. Remember, there was one group that had been left back at Jerusalem who, whenever Simon, Jonathan, and Judas were getting so much glory by routing the Gentiles up in Galilee and across the river in Gilead, they said, we want to get some glory for ourselves. And they went over into Philistia and tried to fight and lost a miserable battle as a result. But we're told by the writer of 1 Maccabees that the reason they lost was because they disobeyed the orders of Judas Maccabeus. So obviously we couldn't credit that as a defeat on behalf of the Maccabees because they have not suffered any technical defeats thus far. Here we're going to see a change of events now. Now, I've mentioned the citadel time and time and time again because it was important then and it's still important up in New Testament times. Well, I don't think I'm going to have the time. Do we know enough about the book of Acts where, remember one time over, I think in chapter 21, you can look it up, chapter 21, towards the end of the chapter, Paul's in trouble. Paul's finally come back to Jerusalem, according to his account, to bring an offering for his fellow Jews. He doesn't go into all the details that these are poor Christian Jews that I brought this offering back to, that he had been collecting whenever he had traveled all up through Asia Minor and the various provinces of Greece. He comes back because of the report that Paul is some apostate from the Jewish faith and he's anti-Mosaic in his opinions. Then James and the other leaders want him to adopt some form of outward compromise to appease the Jewish masses in Jerusalem. And remember, there were 4 young men that had a certain vow they had taken, and they wanted Paul to be seen with them as paying the temple charges and going into the temple and purifying himself with them. Paul does, and then a false report is spread among the Jews at Jerusalem that they saw Trophimus, who we know was an Ephesian. He was a Greek, he was not a Jew, had gone into the temple with Paul, which was an atrocity of the first order as far as the Jews were concerned. That was not true. Trophimus was in the city, but Trophimus had not gone into the temple. Paul was too smart. I mean, he's already trying to appease them. He's not going to then undo his own doing by taking a Gentile in there with him. So the Jews catch Paul, they beat him just about to the point of death, until the captain of the Roman force stationed right next to the temple in a place called, it's like a castle. It's called the Castle of Antonia. Whether that's a good name is beside the point. Maybe the Citadel or the Acra would be a better name. That the captain of the Roman force that was lodged in that, it's a whole palace there. It's not just one tower or something. It's where all these Roman soldiers, a whole cohort of soldiers, lived and ate and slept and so forth, to keep a Roman garrison right next to the temple, not just in Jerusalem, but next to the temple. Why? Because these Jews are always having problems, the Jews and the Christians, and so it's a very important and wise decision to have a Roman garrison stationed there in Antonia to keep these matters in check and to keep these matters under control. And Paul actually is taken back into the Castle of Antonia, or at least up onto the steps, I believe, and he finally says, "May I give a speech?" And he gives a speech to all the people below him. They listen until he gets to the word Gentile, then they throw dust in the air and say, "Away with this man." But anyway, you have to kind of understand what we're talking about now to even comprehend that over in the Gospels. This certain place in Jerusalem, close to the temple, where a Gentile force is established, and established to such a point as we'll see. I don't know if we'll see it tonight or not, I don't remember, but you can see right here in 1 Maccabees that you could have the Jews controlling the whole city of Jerusalem, the whole country of Israel. We could still have this Syrian garrison stationed in the Citadel or in the Acra, and there's practically no way to get them out. They can stand there. There's enough room, of course, for food, for water to be stored up months and months and months on end. And we're not really coming to that right now. We're just coming to a prelude to that. But we'll come to that later, where they do attack. This is way down later in the time of Simon, I believe, down in the spring of 142 BC, where they do attack the citadel full strength, finally routing the Syrians out of there. And that is really the date for Jewish independence, although they've rededicated the temple way back in December of 165. It'll be another 20 plus years before they're totally independent because of the citadel. It's always a problem of the citadel. As a matter of fact, you may even have a reference to that. Look out on your chart, way over to the far right-hand side. You see 142, May, Jewish independence begins. That's what I'm talking about. They just don't tell you all the ifs and the ands and the buts and what this really concerns here, depending on how you want to count time. If you look way over to the right here, you see 142, May, Jewish independence begins. That's really down in the period of Simon, right after Jonathan's death. But that will be tied into what I'm going to begin saying now, because it all concerns the citadel. Okay, let's get back to this 6th point. I said the next campaign has Judas attacking the citadel in Jerusalem. Now, we've seen a mentioning of this earlier in chapter 4, 1 Maccabees 4. This is the chapter, remember, whenever they finally get control of the city now. After 3 years, they've finally gotten control of the city, and then we have the rededication of the liturgy and so forth. But whenever they're going into verse 44, actually take the temple and restore all of this, we've got verse 41. Then Judas detailed troops to engage the garrison of the citadel. That's the only reference that you have right here. Now that's an important reference because we'd get the following understanding from that. Although they're now controlling practically all of Israel in 1 Maccabees 4 because of Judas and his success. And they're obviously controlling all of Jerusalem, which includes the Temple Mount itself. they still do not control the citadel on the basis of this verse. And the citadel was so strongly fortified and really at that time was impregnable that troops could come out, fight against Jews in Jerusalem right at the temple, and run back in the doors before you could really get a hold of them. So Judas very wisely dispatches a group of his men at least to keep the citadel under control so that none of the Syrians at this time are coming out to attack Israel. Now if you jump from there over to chapter 6 and verse 18, notice we'll be back to another meanwhile. And that's because it ties into verse 41 of chapter 4. Meanwhile, the garrison of the citadel were confining the Israelites to the neighborhood of the temple and giving continual support to the Gentiles by their harassing tactics. You see, they're always coming out. Judas backs away and they concentrate on one thing, and then we see that the Syrians come out. The garrison of the citadel were confining Israel to the neighborhood of the temple, giving continual support to the Gentiles by their harassing tactics. Judas, therefore, determined to make an end of them. He gathered all the people together to lay siege to the citadel. Verse 21, some of the besieged garrison escaped and were joined by a number of renegade Israelites. They went to the king and said, how long must we wait for you to come and do justice to these renegades? Our own countrymen, this is a renegade Jew saying this, our own countrymen became our enemies. They actually killed as many of us as they could find and robbed us of our property. Now that's kind of a commentary on, what verse was that? Daniel 11:34b, where we read in Daniel 11:34b that certain of the people joined the Maccabees by flattery. And I told you probably what that meant was they were accustomed to the fact that Judas had become so successful, if he knew you to be a Syrian sympathizer, he'd come and either kill you and generally it's destroy your property, destroy your livestock, destroy your family, and so forth. Well, that's exactly what these Jews are saying. Our own countrymen, meaning the Maccabees, became our enemies. They actually killed as many of us as they could find and robbed us of our property. At this very moment, they are besieging the citadel in Jerusalem and mean to capture it. They've already fortified the temple. Well, this goes on down to the end of this chapter, verse 63, to give you the complete reference. Verses 18 through 63. And it's paralleled in 2 Maccabees 10, verse 9 through 11, verse 38. 2 Maccabees 10, 9 through 11:38. We've already discussed the first 8 verses of 2 Maccabees 10. Now, let me just briefly describe to you what happens. It's too long of a section to read. The Syrians come from Syria to support the citadel and the garrison there under Lysias. Lysias, again, is the commander-in-chief. With 100,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 war elephants. Now, Judas and his men obviously are hopelessly overdone as far as numbers are concerned. 100,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 war elephants. And starting from this time, things begin to go bad for Israel as far as the resistance movement is concerned. We see from verse 28, we'll pick a few verses out just to kind of thread this whole story together. The king, of course, is furious. We've got a new king, remember. Epiphanes is dead. His son Jupiter's on the throne. Jupiter, of course, is furious over what's taking place. That although Israel has gotten her city and gotten her temple back, now she's trying to root out of her country the last remains, the last visible, physical, possible remains of Syrian intervention. That would be the garrison station in the citadel. Verse 34 is interesting as far as history is concerned. The elephants were roused for battle with the juice of grapes and mulberries. got 32 war elephants that are fighting. 500 picked horsemen were assigned to each animal. So you start multiplying that and you see how many people you have involved, although the figures have already been given earlier. These had been stationed beforehand where the beast was, and wherever it went, they went with it, never leaving it. And verse 37, towards the end of it, as well as an Indian driver. I guess we're familiar enough with TV to know about the fact that elephants are in India, and if you've got an elephant, you probably got an Indian driver driving it, or riding it and guiding it. So you got the Syrians, but they've got some dark-skinned Indians from India driving the elephants. It came from India anyway. They certainly don't grow in Syria. Now in verses 42 through 46, we have a sad account because we have the death of one of the Maccabee brothers. Judas advanced with his army and gave battle, and 600 of the king's men were killed. Eleazar, seeing that one of the elephants wore royal armor and stood out above all the rest, thought that the king might have been riding on it. So he gave his life to save his people and win everlasting renown for himself. He ran boldly towards it into the middle of the phalanx, dealing death right and left, while they fell back on either side before him. He got in underneath the elephant and thrust at it from below and killed it, but he didn't move in time. It fell to the ground on top of him. I mean, an elephant, you're talking about a couple of tons, so he should have hit it and then run or set a booby trap off or something. It fell to the ground on top of him, and there he died.
For the continual
Elephant, you're talking about a couple of tons, so he should have hit it and then run or set a booby trap off or something. It fell to the ground on top of him, and there he died. When the Jews saw the strength and impetus of the imperial forces, then they fell back before them. They fell back before them. So here we could say we've got the first defeat as far as the Maccabees are concerned. And it's important because they've not suffered a defeat up until this time. Let's read verses 55 to the end of the chapter to see the outcome of their defeat. By the way, Lysias has come all the way in now and attacked. Now, in other words, the Maccabees are on the defensive because Lysias has taken the offensive and come in and actually attacked the temple. Lysias heard that Philip, whom King Antiochus, that is Epiphanes, had appointed before he died to educate his son, Antiochus Jupiter, for the kingship, had returned from Persia and Media with the late king's expeditionary force, and that he was seeking to take over the government. Now, Lysias has been left in control, but really the new king is Jupiter, although he's young at this time. So Lysias is in a difficult state of affairs. He feels that if he can stay at Jerusalem long enough, he can force the surrender of the Maccabees simply by means of starvation and a lack of water. But now he's got something really more pressing on him, and that is the fact we're going to have terrific internal turmoil back up in Syria if I don't get up there, being really the official military leader, and give my support to Jupiter as the king. Otherwise, Philip, who was a trusted counselor of Epiphanes, will take over. So he has to come up with some solution. And that solution is, let's make a truce with the people in Jerusalem. Verse 58. So let us offer these men terms and make peace with them and their whole nation. Let us guarantee their right to follow their laws and customs as they used to do. For it was our abolition of these customs and laws that brought all these problems. The proposal met with the approval of the king and the commanders, and an offer of peace was sent and accepted. The king and his commanders bound themselves by oath, and on the agreed terms the besieged emerged from their stronghold. But when the king entered Mount Zion and saw how strongly the place was fortified, then he went back on the oath that he had sworn and gave orders for the surrounding wall to be demolished, which we'll see is built later on in the book of Maccabees. Then he went off at top speed to Antioch. So the Syrians weren't to be trusted. Evidently it was an honest and reliable peace treaty and truce until he got in there and saw how fortified the city was. And then he hates to think about, get out of here then they've got this city again, and we've got this agreement that they're okay, we're okay, but I thought they were weaker. As long as I think they're weak, then I'll accept this treaty with them, because I can overrun them later on anytime I want to. But once I realize they're not so weak, then you don't want to make this agreement, but he actually destroys the wall. And this account with a lot of other details is found in 2 Maccabees 10:9 through 11:38, which we won't take the time to look at. Something else I want to fit under this sixth point would be 2 Maccabees chapters 12 and 13. And we would refer to that as just other various battles that are fought during this short reign of Jupiter. Somewhere between those dates, 164, 162, I believe, that you'll have on your chart. 2 Maccabees 12 and 13. Other battles fought during the reign of Jupiter. So that all that we have here under this sixth point deals with the reign of Jupiter. That will keep that in mind. Okay, let's come in the seventh place to another, a series of important events, because we have the arrival of a new king. Demetrius I Soter comes to the throne in 162 BC. He is the son of Seleucus IV, brother of Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the Great. He comes to the throne in 162 BC. We see this in 1 Maccabees 7, verses 1 to 4, and 2 Maccabees 14, verses 1 and 2. We also have a new high priest named Alcimus, Alcimus, and he, as well as some other things, will be our topic next week. Alcimus. But Alcimus becomes the new wicked high priest. No surprise to us. And Maccabeus is selected to crush Judas and his followers. And he's going to become an important man as far as we're concerned for the next few chapters. Maccabeus, Bacchhides. Bacchhides. So Alcimus is the new wicked, pro-Syrian, Hellenistically minded Jewish high priest. And Maccabeus is the new antagonist from Syria against Israel. That's according to 1 Maccabees 7, 5 to 25, and 2 Maccabees 14, 3 through 10. We're going to read a few of these events to see what's going on. By the way, Demetrius also, just like Epiphanes and some of these others, he has been a captive in Rome for a number of years. You can see this here in the first verse of chapter 7 of the first book. Demetrius, son of Seleucus, left Rome and landed with a handful of men at a town on the coast, and there made himself king. All the godless renegades from Israel, led by Alcimus, who aspired to be high priest, came to the king. The new king now is Demetrius. You always have to keep the kings in mind and who the Syrian general is now. The important one is Maccabees, and which high priest is ruling in Israel, and which Maccabean brother is ruling in Israel. They said to him, Judas and his brothers have killed all your supporters. And so we see in verse 8, the king chose Maccabeus, one of the royal friends, who was governor beyond Euphrates. He had called him from the eastern part of the empire. A man of high standing in the empire and loyal to the king. And he sent him and the godless Alcimus, on whom he had conferred the high priesthood, with orders to take vengeance on Israel. They set out with a large army and entered Judea. And Maccabeus sent envoys to Judas and his brothers to make false offers of friendship. But when they saw what a large force he had brought with him, they took no notice of these others. That's the old axiom of your actions speak louder than your words. If you came to offer peace, why'd you bring your army with you then? Deputation of doctors of the law. Now, before I get into this, verses 12 to 16 are important because they show us something about these hyper-religious people in Israel known as the Hasidim or the Hasidians. You remember that name now? We've covered them before. Let me explain what we're going to see here. We're going to end up with a lot of them being tricked and they end up dying, but why? Well, the Hasidians go before the king, go before Maccabeus, even go before the high priest Alcimus, and make overtures as far as peace is concerned. Now, according to the earlier account, back in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, the Hasidians were some of the earliest ones to actually join the renegade Maccabees in their guerrilla warfare. They went out into the desert with them, and they participated. They, according to Daniel 11, were some of the few wise ones, remember, who instructed the many, the lay people, in the ways and the laws and the teachings of Moses. So the question would arise, why then would the Hasidim or the Hasidians, why would they be making overtures as far as peace is concerned with the Syrians or with the Syrian-controlled high priesthood, Alcimus? He's a Hellenistically minded high priest in Israel. Well, it's because of a very clear distinction that has to be made between the Hasidians and between the Maccabees. The Hasidim or the Hasidians were purely religious people. And they were in this resistance movement only so far as to gain their religious freedom back. In other words, they really don't have any desire to support the political aims of Judas and his brothers. Well, since they have their religious freedom back, the temple has been restored to them, sacrifice is being offered again, the altar rededicated. Why would the Hasidians or the Hasidim have to continue to run around with the bad company of the Maccabees? Well, they don't. They don't think that they do. They're only in this for the religious aspect of obtaining freedom to worship God and to serve God as they feel is scriptural. And they think that the Maccabees have not only a religious idea at stake, but political ambitions as well. And there's no doubt about that, they do, because the two inevitably go together somehow, one way or the other. The politics and the religion go together. You can say there's a separation of the two in this country, but there's not. Politics in this country are based on religion, whether we want to call it the Christian religion, is something that would be debatable. We don't feel that it would be, although some people say we're founded on Christian principles. It's always tied up in that. They're always tied together. They are going after some religious belief of theirs, such as humanism, the worship of the God of one's mind, one's intellect, and so forth. Well, anyway, the Hasidians make a mistake separating the two, religion and politics, because if political control is still exercised over you, then that's going to be sprinkled down anyway on religious control as well. A deputation, so with that in mind, we'll read the verses. A deputation of doctors of the law came before Alcimus and Maccabeus asking for justice. The Hasidians were, in fact, the first group in Israel to make overtures to them, and the first to go with the Maccabees as well. So it's kind of a sad commentary on what had to happen to them. For they said to themselves, a priest of the family of Aaron. And that was important to them because Alcimus does happen to be from the Aaronic stock. Although he's not from the high priestly family, he is from the Aaronic stock. Remember, their problem earlier with Menelaus had been that he was a Benjamite and not a Levite. And therefore we have the end of the high priesthood as such, because we have someone that was not authorized to come in. So they're fairly excited, I guess we could say, that a priest of the family of Aaron has come with their forces, and he will do us no harm. The language of Alcimus was conciliatory. He assured them on oath that no harm was intended to them or their friends. But once he had gained their confidence, this is a repetitious story in the books of Maccabees, he arrested 60 of them and put them to death in a single day. And you'll see this over in 2 Maccabees 14, verses 3 to 10. So a sad state of affairs here. Okay, we come then in the 8th place. We only have to go to 10 to get down to Judas' death, which will end our discussion tonight. Here we have the campaign against Nicanor. the campaign against Nicanor. And once again, tide turns in the favor of the Jews because they're going to be successful in this campaign. That would be 1 Maccabees 7, verses 26 through 50, and 2 Maccabees 14, verse 11 through 15, verse 39. Here we're going to see that Nicanor's forces suffer a crushing defeat. He himself ends up killed, and the Jews enter a short period of peace. And with this, we would conclude the book of 2 Maccabees, as we'll see here in a moment. Let's jump down here in 1 Maccabees 7, that first verse I gave you, verse 26. Then the king sent Nicanor. Now, we've seen him time and time again. He's one of the important Syrian generals, one of his distinguished commanders and a bitter enemy of Israel, with orders to wipe them out. He came to Judas, and they greeted one another as friends, yet the enemy were preparing to kidnap Judas. He finds out, verse 33, after these events, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion, begins to mock some of the priests, some of the Levites, saying, if you don't deliver up Judas to me, we'll take away your sacrifice again. Verse 43, we get the battle. The armies joined battle on the 13th of the month Adar, and the army of Nicanor suffered a crushing defeat, he himself being the first to fall in the battle. When his army saw that Nicanor had fallen, they threw away their arms and took to flight. The Jews, sounding the signal trumpets in the enemy's rear, pursued them as far as Gazarah, a day's journey from Adasa. From all the villages of Judea round about, the inhabitants came out and attacked their flanks, forcing them back upon their pursuers. They all fell by the sword. There were no survivors. The Jews seized spoil and booty. They cut off Nicanor's head and that right hand which he had stretched out so arrogantly back earlier toward the priest, and brought them to be displayed at Jerusalem. And there was great public rejoicing, and that day was kept as a special day of jubilation. It was ordained that the day should be observed annually on the 13th of Adar. Thus Judea entered upon a short period of peace. Well, for a good reason, it's entitled a crushing defeat in verse 43 of Nicanor. Because we see, so far, nothing really like this has happened before. They keep coming in. Maybe Judas will be victorious against a Gorgias, or against a Nicanor earlier, or against a Ptolemaeus, or against a Lysias, or against someone. Maybe he'll be victorious, but it's not a crushing defeat, though. One side wins, the other side retreats. But according to this account, not only did one side win, but they won in the absolute sense of the word, so that not a survivor was found afterwards. That's probably why we have verse 50 tacked on there. Thus Judea entered upon a short period of peace, because now she has so completely expelled, not the citadel, remember, but so completely expelled the Syrians in such a crushing defeat that they enter into a short period of peace. Now, if you'll turn over to 2 Maccabees, I gave you 14:11 through 15:39. You look at verse 15:39, you see where that is. 2 Maccabees chapter 15 and verse 39. That ends the scope of purpose of the author of 2 Maccabees, evidently only to bring us down to one of these very important and major victories, the defeat of Nicanor under Judas Maccabaeus. Thus we have the conclusion of the book of 2 Maccabees. Again, we see in verse 32, this hand that had bragged from this blasphemer was cut off, his tongue was cut out. It was supposed to be some day of celebration, verse 36. Then the author tells us in verse 38, at this point, the defeat of Nicanor, probably around 161 BC if you want to know the date. I will bring my work to an end, If it is found well written and aptly composed, that is what I myself hoped for. If cheap and mediocre, I can only do my best. For just as it is disagreeable to drink wine alone and water alone, whereas the mixing of the two gives a pleasant and delightful taste, so too variety of style in a literary work charms the ear of the reader, especially varieties of errors found therein. Let this then be my final word. Praise the Lord, he didn't write another book. So we're through with Second Maccabees. We won't be back over there anymore. We'll just be with First Maccabees. So we're through with references, always taking you over there. Number 9. We have introduction of the Romans into the field of play. First Maccabees 8, verses 1 through 32. And it's interesting to see, in light of the fact that I'm sure in this church we are all cognizant of who is in control of not only the Middle East, but in particular Israel during the New Testament era, who actually invites the Romans into involvement in the Middle East. It happens to be the Jews themselves. And of course they are the ones who are going to suffer more than anyone, just a couple of centuries removed from this time in the New Testament period. But the Romans so far have not touched anything as far as Syria is going on, as far as what's going on in Israel, anything in the Mesopotamian region. They haven't touched that. They've confined their efforts basically to North Africa and to some of the western provinces in Asia and Asia Minor. They've already defeated the Greeks earlier at the Battle of Pydna that we've discussed before. They defeated the Macedonians there, which gave them control over the Greeks. But so far no door has been opened for their involvement in the Middle East. And the people who open the door would be Judas, the Maccabees, their followers, the Jewish people as such. Open the door for involvement in the Middle East by the Romans, and they're going to suffer terribly 2 centuries removed as a result of that. So the first 32 verses here, we've got the involvement of the Romans. Let's read a few verses, pick a few out that set the scene. The first 16 verses, that's about half of that material. The first 16 just give us a positive description of this new and rising power from the perspective of the Maccabees. In the next half, from verse 17 through 32, describe the peace treaty between these two nations. So we can see that they are quite enamored, the Maccabees are, with the Romans as this new upstart rising Mediterranean power, for whom the Mediterranean Sea became their lake in the backyard. Now Judas had heard about the Romans. They were renowned for their military power and for the welcome they gave to those who became their allies. Any who joined them could be sure of their firm friendship. He was told about the wars they had fought, conquest of the Gauls, success in Spain, down in verses 5 to 8. He had even conquered Antiochus the Great before. Conquered the Greeks, verse 12, with their friends, however, and all who put themselves under their protection, they maintained a firm friendship. We'll see it's going to backfire on them later on. Just like the Hasidian movement backfired whenever they went to Alcimus, this will backfire as well. And then, as I say, from verse 17 through verse 32, the end of that chapter, we see the content of the peace treaty signed. And that basically would be an offensive and defensive one. If you were to go and fight against another nation, let's say Israel was to fight against another nation, then Rome was to fight as well. Defensively, if a nation attacked you as Israel, then it attacked Rome vicariously, and Rome would fight as well. So it was an offensive, defensive type peace treaty that was signed. That was not always carried out in all of those details. Certainly true, or Rome would have come over here and wiped the Syrians off the map. But we know that doesn't happen. And then finally this evening we have the death of Judas. This is the first part of chapter 9, first third, verses 1 through 22. Very sad in Israel's history because remember he has been the most apt military leader that she's had. As a matter of fact, I guess I could supply a little more praise to the account of Judas. He's probably, according to Jewish history and historians, Judas Maccabaeus is probably one of the top, by top I mean top 5 out of, we don't know how many, untold hundreds and thousands, one of the top military leaders that Israel, the nation, has ever produced. And just reading the books of Maccabees, I think, would validate that claim. He's one of the top military leaders. Like we've had a George Washington, well, Israel has had a Judas Maccabeus, one of the most able military leaders. Now, that doesn't take into consideration people like Joshua, who had fire from out of heaven and cities crashing because God shook the ground and, all of this to happen. They're not fighting, with such a visible presence of God around them. All it took is just one little Israelite, and they could send 10,000 to flight, according to the Old Testament. But that's back in those days. For that period and all through Israel's history up until modern times, I guess that's been true. So we've got verse 4, 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry sent out against Judas. Notice the numbers, 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. And Judas has 3,000. But when they saw the size of the enemy forces, their courage failed, and many deserted, leaving them a mere 800. So we are talking about 20,000 men, 2,000 men on horses against 800. So the odds are overwhelming. And this is what brings Judas' death. Judas saw that with the campaign going against him, his army, people are melting away. He's losing people. Well, he's trying to rally them. He said, let's attack anyway. Verse 8, let us move to the attack and see if we can defeat them. But his men tried to dissuade him, saying, impossible. And it's impossible for 800, unless you have the intervention of God, 800 men to defeat 22,000. But Judas prevails over his counselors. They fight anyway. Verse 13, the earth shook at the din of the armies as battle was joined, and they fought from dawn until evening. Well, that's praise in itself, that 800 men could fight 22,000 for a solid day, 12-hour period. That's remarkable. They had some type of help. Verse 17, the fighting became very heavy, and many fell on both sides, and here it is in one little short phrase, Judas himself fell. The rest of the Jews took to flight. Jonathan and Simon carried off Judas their brother, and they buried him in the family tomb at Modin. Wept over him, and great was grief in Israel. They mourned him for many days, saying, how is our champion fallen, the Savior of Israel? The rest of the history of Judas, his wars, exploits, achievements, all these were so numerous that they have not been written down. And that's probably true. First Maccabees is a reliable book. All of what is being said about Judas is not just hyper praise or hyped up praise. It no doubt historically, not just legendarily, is true as far as Judas and his success is concerned.